So welcome everybody. I think it's apparent to everybody why we're here. Tomorrow is the Mary. Thank you. Tomorrow is the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and right at that moment, we had the privilege of having many of our colleagues here from SAIS to reflect on this, who come with an enormous amount of expertise and insight into these issues, and we now have reached the one-year anniversary. And I think it's hard to believe, first, for many of us, that this happened in the first place, but second, that we're still dealing with it. And so we're going to have a chance to reflect a little bit on what we've learned so far, and then what we might anticipate going forward as we enter the war's second year. I'm not going to do long introductions because this is a group of people who are both very distinguished and very known to most of you. On the screen, we have Anna Applebaum, who is a Senior Fellow of International Affairs here at SAIS and a Senior Fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, and a really enormously well-respected commentator with deep experience and insight into Ukraine, into the region, and so many other aspects of the challenges we're facing. To my left, Thomas Ritt, who's the founding director of our Alperovitch Institute for Cybersecurity Studies here and a professor of strategic studies at SAIS. To his left, Michael Kofman, who's the research director of the Russian Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis and a senior adjunct fellow at, we have CNA and CNAS, right? That makes it easy, Michael. Yeah. Exactly, and to the far left, Mary Sarotte, who's the Marie-Josée and Henry Kravis Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and a well-known observer of events of this region. So I want to start with each of you. Some of you were less surprised than others of us at the way in which Russia went in to Ukraine a year ago. But I want to ask you, and start with Anne, if it's okay, Anne, what has surprised you most over the last year as this war has unfolded?
So first of all, thanks. I'm delighted to be here virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there physically. That didn't work this week. I suppose almost every aspect of the war has contained surprises or unexpected changes. I mean, I would say there are really three that are most important. One is the depth, and I'm sure Michael will talk about this more, the depth of the Russian failure. In other words, that the Russian military, which had been so modernized, was not just technologically incapable of fighting in the way that we expected, but also that Russian soldiers were so sluggish and so uninterested and so surprised initially to be there and unprepared for what they were supposed to do. I've recently written about the Russian occupied territories, the violence and brutality that they've exercised there, which seems also partly connected to incompetence. I mean, they didn't expect any Ukrainian resistance. When they found it, they reacted by building torture chambers and murdering local mayors. Then I'd say, secondly, the Ukrainian resistance. I mean, I am not surprised by it, but the world was. The degree to which the Ukrainian army was able to be innovative, to be united, and the way the country stayed united, and the way that the civil society and society just more broadly was able to unify to get behind the army. And this is a very, very divided country in which has historically very bitter politics, very bad public conversation, and somehow, at least up to this point, they've managed to avoid that. And then, of course, thirdly, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, the unity of the Western alliance, but also the way in which particular ones of its members have shifted their policy. The Germans before the war, I was on a German television program a couple of weeks before the war started, and the main argument was, should we arm Ukraine? And of course, everybody on the program except me and the Ukrainian ambassador was saying, no, of course not. It's a terrible idea. It goes against all of our, foreign policy principles. And that they turned on a dime, that they have become the third largest donor of weapons to Ukraine, even though, we can argue about whether it's enough and so on, indicates a real sea change in thinking about Germany's place in Europe and Europe's role more broadly. And then, of course, the the American contribution is, again, we can argue maybe later on about whether it's enough and whether it's correct and so on, but the willingness of the Biden administration to really step up and support a battle that it didn't ever expect to have. I mean, most of the, a year ago today, everybody was expecting Zelensky to escape the country and Kiev to be captured, within a few weeks, if not a few days. And so I expected something a little bit different, so I wasn't entirely surprised. I always thought that when tanks actually start rolling across Europe again, when people see the war in Germany, in the US, in Ukraine, they will react differently. And that proved to be the case. And it's actually an important principle to remember going forward, that it may be that there are some things we're going to have to see and feel and experience before we're able to know what the correct reaction is.
That's great. And I'm going to ask each of you the same question. And we'll obviously come back to each of the points that Anne raised. But Thomas, your views about surprises?
Yeah, surprises. I would echo a few of the observations that Anne Applebaum made there, specifically on the on Germany and other European countries, but especially Germany because of its particular way it dealt with its own belligerent past. I'm not sure I would call it turn on a dime. Of course, they did turn on a dime on specific issues, but the movement of adjusting, of coming to terms with this war that is so close to Germany, I think is ongoing. It moved faster and in more unexpected ways than I think many of us expected. But it's important to appreciate, I think, that inside Germany, the war has caused significant tensions and brought to the fore contradictions that were never really resolved since World War II. And so I think we will be talking, even if the war ended, soon, which I think is very unlikely, we will be talking about this conflict, about this war for literally generations. And that, of course, nobody expected. I was at the Munich Security Conference last year, almost obviously to the day. And I remember, as Anne alluded to, really the arrogance of so many people who simply made the assumption that Zelensky would defect and joke about the amount of luggage he would likely have brought to Munich. And I think it's probably also incumbent on us collectively, as scholars, experts, diplomats, politicians, civil servants who focus and who watch the war in Ukraine, to really come to terms with our failure in early stages, in the beginning of the war, to really assess the Ukrainian resolve in this whole war, which I think will ultimately also speak to the future, because it seems very unlikely that Ukraine at this stage, it seems to me, and I'm sure others will chime in on this question, but it seems very unlikely to me that Ukraine will lose this war, even if it will drag on for years to come. The resolve that they have displayed so far is really remarkable. I'll just stop here because I think we'll touch on other aspects of the war down the line.
Michael?
Sure. So, of course, it's difficult to know where to begin. As a military analyst, maybe I'd highlight a couple things that really surprised me. First, the Russian concept of operations was very different than I think many of us expected, because I think we'd imagined the kind of firebreak that war optimism, wildly erroneous political assumptions about Ukraine would drive the invasion. And folks like me predicted that the war would actually happen and that Russia would pursue maximalist war aims. But then thought that the Russian military would be ordered to take the Ukrainian military seriously and would put together a real joint force operation that would be a real fight. And I think the general assumption was that, the Russian military would win in the conventional phase of the war, but would struggle to occupy Ukraine. It didn't look like they had the forces for the kind of occupation they were envisioning. But actually, the Russian military was thrown into a high-risk regime change operation whose main level of effort was decapitation. And they drove in administratively. Many of them were not prepared, didn't have the rules of engagement. They were told to avoid the main fights in the main cities, and they kind of thought Ukraine would surrender. They were trying to recreate, a kind of much larger version of Crimea 2014. I think folks like me very much misread it. There's the political assumptions fundamentally shaped the military strategy and the concept of operations. It was almost difficult to imagine a plan that would both seem so foolhardy and so risky, and without any kind of hedge strategy behind it. Right? They really didn't have a plan B, and they only assumed that the war would last at most about 2 weeks. The second thing that really surprised me, to be honest, is not Ukrainian will to fight, because it was clear Ukrainians were going to resist, and they did in 2014 and 2015. But how it materialized, right? Because in the run-up to the war, one of the reasons I think we really underrated Ukrainian military performance or potential to defend, that there wasn't much in the way of visible, systematic preparation on the Ukrainian side. And part of that's because it was rather hidden, and part of that's because there really actually wasn't, okay? to be honest, it actually was a little bit what it looked like. And a lot of Ukrainian volunteers and veterans really showed up in those critical early days in the Russian operation to hold off Russian troops. And you can picture it as almost invisible force. It was very difficult to account for, as honest. Some folks had a better sense of that, and that would happen. Like in Applebaum, we went back and forth a bit ahead of the war, and some people's instincts on that were better, whereas I, as an analyst, am very kind of empirically driven, right? So the things I can't see, I often have a hard time accounting for. The same thing goes for morale and intangibles, right? You know why we call them intangibles? It's because they're hard to measure. If they were easy to measure, we would call them tangibles. We could count them the way we count tanks, right? We can't just empirically say Ukrainian morale 10, Russian morale 3. These are the numbers we're assigning for the basis of this discussion. And the last point I say, actually what really surprised me is how U.S. policy turned on a dime in terms of intelligence sharing in ways that would shape battlefield outcomes that I think we still have a lot more to learn about. And I'm not saying this to take anything away from the Ukrainian war effort. But I want to be frank that I think Ukrainian will to fight and how Ukrainians showed up in the first couple of days, Zelensky choosing to stay and the leaders individuals made, were decisive in that critical first week and maybe the overall first 3 weeks of the Russian campaign. But Western intelligence support and material assistance over time, following the spring and summer and up to now, has been a very significant factor in shaping outcomes. And I'll tell you, in the run-up to this conflict, as somebody who does this not from an academic but more an applied perspective, policymakers never asked what this war could look like if they themselves truly backed Ukraine. If they provided the intelligence, if they provided the material assistance, they would always ask what the war would look like if Ukraine essentially fought alone. And they got the answers to the questions they asked, right? But in fairness, looking back on it, I myself didn't expect the U.S. policy would change, actually in the first week, in a way that I would say policymakers refused to look at that proposition. Last point I'll make, and I'll turn over to my colleague, Sarotte, because I'm actually very curious what she has to say on this. But I think it's always difficult to even kind of write an early history of this because there's a lot we don't know, and a lot of the things that we do know early on will end up not being true. But my own view of it is, it's a somewhat simplistic narrative that we overrated the Russian military and sort of underestimated Ukrainian military capability. It's actually really the confluence of events. Right? It's the Russian plan and the way it interacted with Ukrainian resistance and the choice that individuals made. But at the end of the day, none of this was really that overdetermined. It's easy to write history backwards. It was actually very contingent, right? And the more we find out about the early days, the clearer it becomes how much of this hinged on individual decisions, on certain factors, right? That this is not we are fortunate, I think we are fortunate to be living in this particular timeline of how these events played out.
Yeah, thank you. Honored to be here. I also have to thank my Wednesday class, New World Orders, which reminded me last night that this event is today. So it is thanks to them. They are here in force. Whoop, whoop. Thank you to all of them that I'm here today. But more seriously, obviously, this is a dismal anniversary. So it's obviously something we are marking, not celebrating. And I guess for me, if the question is, what are the surprises? Obviously, I share the same surprises that all of my colleagues just mentioned. Perhaps an additional surprise for me didn't have to do with Putin, but with the lack of understanding that major land war was returning to Europe. I had been listening to Michael Kofman. I had been trying to follow the Russian military deployment, especially when they pulled things from the Far East. I had been looking at the historical pattern because I obviously am a historian, and there was in history a clear pattern. Putin marks his own birthdays, anniversaries that are important to him with violence. Sometimes that's cyber, sometimes that's kinetic, but there is a clear pattern. So, for example, dissidents end up dead on his birthday. The human rights activist Anna Politkovskaya was murdered by gunshot at close range while carrying in her groceries on October 7th, 2006, Putin's birthday. Fast forward a decade, the hacked emails from the Hillary Clinton campaign were dropped on October 7th, 2016, Putin's birthday. There's Soviet anniversaries. The attempts to influence social media in 2016, of course, were in the 25th anniversary year of Soviet collapse, and on and on and on. There's a bunch of violent events that happen. So either Putin is directly ordering these, or he has let people around him know that he would like these kind of tributes. So as I was working on my most recent book called Not 1 Inch, I was getting documents declassified in the teens, 2015, 2016, 2017. I had a big breakthrough in 2018 when I got most of the conversations between Clinton and Yeltsin and some with Putin declassified after a 3-year appeal fight. When I did that, the Kremlin complained. There was actually Dmitry Peskov issued a complaint against the Clinton Library for releasing those materials to me. So I figured they must be good. And the question then became, once I had all that material, when to publish. And I decided in about late 2019, early 2020, that there was simply no way Putin was going to let the 30th anniversary of Ukraine pulling away and the 30th anniversary of Soviet collapse pass without some kind of violence. I didn't know what. I certainly didn't know he was going to take Kyiv in 3 days, but the pattern was clear. And so I said to my publisher, we should publish this book in December 2021 because that's the 30th anniversary, because something is going to happen. I don't know what, but something is. And so it just seemed, it seemed to me that there was a clear pattern. So the surprise for me, I don't want to make myself out as prescient. I wasn't, I didn't know on February 24th you would take Kyiv, but it was clear something was going to happen. The surprise for me was how hard it was to convince people of that. So the book manuscript closed in, I think, July 2021. So I then had, a few months on my hands before the book appeared. And I spent the fall of 2021 trying to place an op-ed entitled Deadly Anniversary of a Divorce. And the punchline of the op-ed was 30 years after the divorce between Russia and Ukraine, Putin is acting like a bitter ex who's going to show up and do something violent. And this op-ed was turned down by every important publication in the English-speaking world. Various excuses, but the answer was no. This op-ed did not appear. All I have is a lot of emails in my inbox that were rejections. Fast forward to February 24th, when all of a sudden I got emails and even phone calls saying, did we say no to that op-ed? That was a misunderstanding. We meant yes. Could you please do that? Did we say we were overcommitted? Sorry, can you do this tonight for us? And so if you, Google my name, you'll suddenly see a bunch of op-eds all around that anniversary as a result of that. And that process of seeing just blanket denial of what was coming and then the reversal, really, for me, that was surprising. What also surprised me was talking to friends and colleagues, particularly in Germany, and my friend Andreas Witter, he was not in this group, but my friends in Germany were unanimous. I lived there for about 4 years, and that war was not going to happen. My Russian friends were telling me I was worried about that for nothing. This was a bluff on the part of Putin. I really just ran into this, resistance everywhere. And I, began to think, am I nuts? But I saw this clear historical pattern. And so the fact that it was such a surprise that war came to everyone in the West and including and many people in Russia, that was to me in itself a surprise. True. Because, there were clear signs that it was coming.
Terrific. So let's stay with Ukraine for a minute. And, because I would say, if I were asking myself my question, one of the surprises to me is less the resolve of the Ukrainian people, and maybe even less on the military side, but the relatively capable functioning of the Ukrainian government. But we've also seen problems. There have been concerns about corruption. Like, you're a pretty close watcher of this, Anne. How do you assess how the Ukrainian government as a kind of an institution has functioned, not just on the military side, but sort of keeping the country together, dealing with the problems of, sustaining food and water and energy? And what's your assessment about the long-term capacity of this government under Zelensky to step up to the extraordinary challenges of dealing with this long-term struggle?
So, it's an interesting question. I mean, I was in Munich over the weekend and met a lot of Ukrainians, and some are beginning to point to problems inside the way the government is run. It's very, very centralized. There's a lot of control over the media, which they won't be able to maintain forever. There's a lot of slack that is cut for Zelensky because he's the war leader and because they're at war. And, you do hear people say, well, after the war, I'm going to want something different, or sooner or later, I want to talk about the failure of Zelensky to prepare the country better for the war. There's going to be a lot of looking backwards onto that. Mike was right. The Ukrainians weren't prepared. They didn't tell people. They didn't protect their cities. There was a lot more that could have been done in the days running up to the war. And so there is a sense of, kind of, we're all in suspension. We're waiting to have this more critical conversation until it becomes appropriate to do so. Having said that, Zelensky has outperformed expectations, and not only, that makes it sound, he's outperformed almost every, Western or European leader of the last decade. I think what he's very, very good at, and what he understood his role to be, was in presenting an image of Ukraine to the world and also to the Ukrainians. And so some of the things that he does, the uniform he wears, the T-shirts and the sweatshirts and so on. This is the uniform of the territorial army. This is what ordinary Ukrainian soldiers wear. It's not what generals wear. He doesn't wear epaulets or medals or anything like that, which he could if he wanted to. He's the commander in chief. He's been very clear to constantly use a kind of self-deprecating way of talking about himself. I am the leader, but you are the people who are fighting. It's you who I'm celebrating. And he's done the same in the Western world. He communicates using his cell phone, which is how ordinary people communicate. He doesn't have a big press conference. He doesn't show up like Putin does, at a long table or in a big room with television lights and makeup and so on. And all that has been, of course, that's all deliberate. They think a lot about how to present him. But it also works because it's true. He is an ordinary guy who found himself in an unusual position, and his emotions are authentic, and they move people because they're real. And so although there are tensions inside the system, and there remains this kind of conflict between the younger reformers and others inside the system who are, more attached to the ways of doing things in the past, and that conflict will eventually come to light. For the moment, Zelensky has held together both the country and the alliance through his communication skills. So I still give them a lot of space. They have, they really outperformed expectations, but even in terms of not just the military fight, but in terms of caring for refugees, delivering digital services to Ukrainians. A lot of attention has rightly been paid to the digital minister who, every Ukrainian now has all their documents inside their phones. This has turned out to be incredibly important for refugees. The country is still running and functioning. If you go there, you discover that Kiev looks actually not that different from what it used to look like. And they've kept the system going in a way that's beyond just fighting the war. There will be tensions down the line when eventually the conflict ends. But for now, it continues to be a pretty impressive performance.
That's great. It's really fascinating. So on the military front, Michael, is there a path to victory for the Ukrainians, and what would that look like?
Sure. Look, I think where we are right now in the war, we've come out of a sort of transitional phase taking place in late fall and the winter. Right now, the Russian military is conducting an offensive operation. It's pretty underwhelming in how they're performing because their military is not really in a place where it has strong offensive potential. May be able to offer a stubborn defense, but pretty clearly so far still fairly poor on the offense. Is there a path to Ukraine victory? Well, the first path is actually poor Russian strategy and impatience. And you're watching it play it again right now in the second battle of Donbass. The Russian military may to an extent exhaust itself and create some openings and leave itself vulnerable. Not in the way it did back in the fall. I don't think there's going to be a repeat of a successful operation like Kharkiv, but maybe something closer to Kherson. So Ukraine does have a path towards military victory. But of course, it depends on how you define victory, right? Here's a big problem with wars like this. First, it's often up to the loser to decide when the war is over. Even if you achieve what you believe to be a decisive military victory, they may continue a war of attrition. They may refuse to concede defeat, okay? Unless you can literally drive to Moscow, it's not that easy, right? You can compel them over time to acknowledge the reality on the ground, but don't assume that victory is that easy when the other regimes fully committed themselves to the war, right? Second, as far as we look at how Ukraine defines victory, they're pretty clear about it, right? And a lot of it has to do with liberating territory and restoring territorial control. And at the end of the day, all of it, maybe, and that includes Crimea, or forcing a final status negotiation on Crimea that returns Crimea to Ukrainian authority. So is it possible? Yeah, it depends on how well they do on the battlefield at the end of the day. And it also very much depends on the extent of Western support they get. So often, I often end up back in the same series of questions with colleagues who makes decisions on this going back a year ago, where they say, how do you think it's going to play out? And I say, well, that depends on what you choose to do. So it's sort of like pretzel logic, right? If you don't provide the military assistance support, then it won't go well and it'll become a stalemate. And then you'll say we arrived at a stalemate because the actions you chose, what you chose to do or didn't choose to do, help bring us to a stalemate. So long story short, yeah, I think it's definitely possible, but at the end of the day, it has to play out on the battlefield. I think maybe later this summer is a good like mental marker of when to look as to how this war is going. But at the end of the day, you kind of have to give it a chance.
Excellent. So a number of you have touched on as one of the surprises, or clearly one of the important developments of the war, was the degree of both unity and commitment on the part of the Europeans and with the United States. I want to explore that a bit here. It strikes me that in the last week or two in particular, with the president's visit to Kyiv, to the speech in Poland and the like, that the administration has sort of ratcheted up a kind of the existential and moral nature of this conflict. A lot more talk about crimes against humanity. I heard it on the radio coming in this morning. My question is, twofold, which is, one, obviously, in terms of the resolution of the war, this makes it more challenging, right? If the other side is a war criminal and the like, it's hard to negotiate an end to it. But perhaps more importantly, this potentially raises some tensions with America's European allies, who have been looking to keep avenues open to Moscow and to Putin. We've seen this with Macron and others. So maybe both Thomas and Mary, if you could just reflect, one, on, do you see a difference in the tone of the U.S. now taking a sort of cutting off any kind of avenues for a really serious discussion, if in fact the President Putin is guilty of war crimes here and crimes against humanity? And second, is that something that can be sustained with the Europeans? Thomas, you want to start?
I think it's maybe helpful to take a very large step back. I think as I look around, I don't see many Europeans, certainly on the panel, but I'm not sure how to count you, Michael, in this context.
I'm American. I'm originally from Ukraine, but I'm very.
Yeah.
We can talk about European.
But what I was trying to tease out with this comment is, I think it makes a difference whether you're from the old world or from the new world.
There's old Donald Rumsfeld in this, you've just you've thrown into the mix here. I recognize the distinction.
Thanks for the Rumsfeld prompt, because I think the key point here that to tease out is that a lot of Americans seem to think Europeans don't understand war. Obviously a cliche that arrived post 9/11 and post Iraq War, during the Iraq War and after. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. It's completely misguided. If anything, Europeans, and I say this writ large, including the whole continent, and of course there are stark differences here, if anything, they understand war too well. Remember, you asked about war crimes committed by the Russian Federation and its armed forces. In Europe, almost every country, and of course some countries more than others, have experiences with war crimes, both as perpetrators as well as victims of war crimes. So, I mean, I grew up with stories in my childhood, and this is true for most people in Europe, not just in Germany, true in France for different reasons, every family has almost every family has very dark secrets that they don't like to talk about. Grandmothers getting raped, grandfathers working in concentration camps, or, serving in the Wehrmacht. Remember, between 21 and 26 million Russian Soviet citizens were killed in World War II. These numbers are so what does that mean for today? I don't want to ramble on history here. It means that the attitude towards this war, and including towards Russia, are far more complex and far more deep-rooted than I think what you see here from a distance, from the comfortable distance of Washington and the United States. So, for example, there will, even if Putin continues to commit war crimes that are far more atrocious than what we've already seen, I don't think that will, by definition, cut off venues to talk to the Russian leadership down the line, because basically we had our own history with war crimes, and of course it's abhorrent, but you have to be able to embrace the contradictions here of this history, and I think it's just profound. And let me just tease out one more dynamic here that I think is coming towards us. If you look at how opinion polls in European countries develop over time, and again, I'm using Germany because I just looked those up more recently. Over time, over the past year, support for the war obviously is eroding. And you have all the mainstream centrist parties in Germany in support of helping the Ukrainian government and providing weapons, and increasingly heavy and meaningful weapons, obviously. But at the same time, you have the far left and the far right. There's literally a demonstration happening, I believe, today or tomorrow in Berlin. That's going to be a very large, quote unquote, peace demonstration with far left and far right participation. The longer the war continues, the more pictures we see of literally, I saw one yesterday, of literally piles of dead Russian personnel. In this case, it was Wagner personnel, some of them naked. So it brings back these memories and these traumas that we have. That these pictures are very familiar to Europeans. So the longer it continues, the more refugees are imported into, are moving into the rest of Europe, the longer they will stay in the rest of Europe, the more the conflict will embed itself in the European psyche and influence its politics down the line, and I think unfold a very significant polarizing potential that will go beyond the polarizing potential that we see in the United States, because it has different drivers.
Mary?
Yeah, we thanks to Thomas and his wonderful institute, the Alperovitch Institute, we had a terrific dinner with the donor, with Dmitry Alperovitch, who I know was named on NPR today as one of 3 leading Putinologists in the country. The other one sitting next to me, and Yulia Yaffe, he doesn't want the title, but that was on NPR this morning. And at that dinner, we discussed a quotation I had heard in Warsaw last fall, and I'd like to repeat it here because I think it's relevant to your question. So I was attending a conference in Warsaw in the fall. It was an off-the-record event, but it was a mixture of scholars, policymakers, some in office, some out of office. And one of the military officers there said, "You know what's going on? This is about the 3 tribes of NATO resolving their differences." The 3 tribes of NATO, according to this officer, being the following. First, there was the tribe of NATO basically bordering Russia, or near to Russia, that was convinced prior to February 24th of a year ago that it was living in a zone of existential threat. The second tribe of NATO were countries in the south believing they were living in a zone of acute threat as a result of immigration, being overwhelmed by immigration. And then there was the third tribe, which was the rest of NATO, which was completely convinced it was living in a zone of eternal peace. And the problem was that the 3 tribes could not communicate with each other, and in particular, zones 1 and 2 and zone 3 simply did not believe each other. And so this officer said, what's happened now is that's, those structures have broken down. That order has broken down, it has crumbled, but we're still sorting out what that means for NATO cooperation, for Western cooperation. I, on this dismal 1-year anniversary, am trying to look for signs of things that are positive. And I personally think, compared to where we were, say 13 months ago, the amount of cohesion that exists in the West is impressive. My biggest worry right now is not is not cohesion in the West. My biggest worry is, for Ukrainians, what they are suffering, which is truly unspeakable and seems to grow more unspeakable. But I actually would like to ask you a question, given the depth of your policy experience. If you had been in the room at what was clearly the meeting before Biden headed off to Europe, or even before Kamala Harris headed to Munich, you've been in the room where the discussion was, okay, are we going to escalate the rhetoric? Are we going to start saying crimes against humanity, war criminal, et cetera? What advice would you have given?
I'd like to get Anne's thought on this as well, but I mean, just trying to step out of my moderator role. And I think that the challenge, and as you can guess, I've been there before on some of these things. And for me, there's a lot of resonances as to how we dealt with the problem with Milosevic in Yugoslavia, is that you have to think through what's next. What's the implication of saying? I mean, I think it's indisputably the case if you're just doing it from a purely analytic point of view that crimes against humanity have been committed. They've been documented. It's not sort of to say, well, we have to do more research or we have to get some more data. I think, though, the question is that once you put it in the framework of the international legal consequences associated with this, does this rise to the level of therefore requiring this to be referred to the International Criminal Court? What are the limits of what you can do, and therefore negotiating with those who've done it, and what our expectations are? Is that there is a very strong implication, particularly if you accuse the head of government of this, that the only answer is the removal of the head of government. And so you have to decide when you're going down that road, what are your expectations? I mean, I think for us, when we decided in the Clinton administration to go forward and pursue the idea of international criminal violations and genocide and ethnic cleansing by Milosevic, it was because we were committed to regime change, right? And so it's not hard in that set of circumstances to say, if you believe that there is no solution with Milosevic still there, then labeling him a war criminal is actually part of the strategy to delegitimize the government and to make it create incentives within the country itself to say there are consequences for you to have a leader who is, subject to these things. So the question that you have to ask yourself, are we really prepared to go down that line here? Which is to say that at the end of the day, it's no longer acceptable for us, for Putin, to be the head of this government. And we will have to orient our policy around that. I think a case can be made for it, but I don't think you can't do the one without the other. You can't sort of accept the idea that you're going to take this extreme form of delegitimization and then say, oh yeah, but meanwhile we're going to, negotiate with him and we don't have a problem with him continuing. But Anne, you've thought a lot about these issues and your perspective on it, and do you see a difference in the U.S. administration's approach, and what consequences would that have?
So it's a great question. I think let me give two pieces of the answer. One piece is just to remind the audience what we mean by the war crimes. I wrote an article recently in the Atlantic that was based on reporting of a lot of Ukrainian journalists who've worked in the occupied territories. And we have, every piece of land that's liberated, they find torture chambers, they find prison cells, there have been concentration camps, there have been deportation of children by the thousands from Ukraine to Russia, taken away from their families, sometimes very small children lost completely because their names aren't recorded. I mean, really horrific things that we haven't seen in Europe, I think even during the Yugoslav wars, but we certainly haven't seen in Europe since the 1940s. And so, there is really no U.S. administration or no European Union, commission that can simply allow that to happen and not comment upon it, remark upon it, or search for some kind of justice. The Ukrainians themselves are systematically documenting things. They are keeping track. They are preparing, war crimes, submissions to the War Crimes Tribunal. This is something that will be part of the conversation going forward in the years ahead. It may even be that someday, maybe not even that far in the future, 2 or 3 years ago from now, we'll look back on this and we will discover so much more of what's happened, and we will be shocked and surprised that we didn't understand it better at the time. So I'm not sure it's an avoidable conversation. I'll say that. Secondly, although of course you're right to be cautious, I also think it's become pretty clear that this war will end when the Russians understand that it was a mistake. So, and whatever that looks like. So, and I've said this a couple of times in the last few days, I'll repeat it now. So as the French in Algeria understood that they couldn't win the war with Algeria, and they no longer had an interest in being an imperial power, as the British once understood in Ireland in the early 20th century that that Ireland was a separate country and wasn't going to remain part of the United Kingdom. Some revelation like that has to come about in Moscow. And whether it comes around because, Putin wakes up in the morning and changes his mind, whether he falls down the stairs, whether something else happens, that's not really our problem, and we have no impact on that. We can't, we're not going to pretend that we have some influence on internal events in Moscow, but we can begin to shape the conversation. And I don't think it's wrong for the U.S. administration to try and do so. I mean, you've actually now heard 3 people say it, because Biden said it in his speech in Warsaw a couple of days ago, Harris said it at Munich, and Blinken has said it as well, that war crimes or crimes against humanity have been committed and people will be held to account. Now, I haven't heard a program detailing what they're going to do about it, and I'm look forward to hearing whether or not there is one. But it strikes me that the decision may have been taken to start shaping the conversation in Russia. And difficult though it may be, and it's far more difficult than any conversation about Milosevic or Yugoslavia, it might be necessary, because if it doesn't happen, I don't see how we end the conflict. Again, I'm talking about end it, not have a frozen conflict, not have a ceasefire that we come back to in 3 years, not have, Minsk 3 or 4, or 16, not have a constant, not eliminate the possibility that hostilities could be renewed at any moment. I mean, an end to the war, meaning Russia decides it's not an imperial power, or at least that it's not interested anymore in occupying Ukraine, that it wasn't worth the price. That has to happen. And to the extent that the U.S. we have very few tools that are, to which we can help make that happen. One of them is helping the Ukrainians on the battlefield. The other is, is diplomacy and some conversation about justice. And I think it's unavoidable, and I think it's time we started to think more systematically about how to do it.
I agree with that, but my own view is that precisely because I agree with you that the only way to get this is for a fundamental change in Moscow. That if you're going to delegitimate, you got to take it seriously, and you just can't then turn around and say, "Oh yeah, but the next G20 meeting it'll all be fine," right? And you go. I guess that's my main
absolutely
point.
no, I agree with you.
Once you go down the road, you have to go down the road, and because you can never delegitimate if you're only kind of partially delegitimating. All right, let's move on to the question about whether this is going to change how we think more broadly about the stake that the U.S. has and the stake that Europeans have on these broader questions, because it's obviously a conflict in Europe right now, but the fact that few prepared for this and that it happened, then everybody realized we had to respond. Do you think this changes how people think about, for example, the Pacific? And thinking about the potential of conflicts there or in other parts of the world, in terms of the pendulum that both the U.S. and others go through about the need to be proactive in deterring conflict. Right? I mean, there's been a lot of commentary recently in the press. I'm not sure fair, but it's been made, suggesting that this was a failure of deterrence by the U.S. and Europe for failure to be more forceful before. And the lesson that should be learned both for Europe and for Asia is that you have to be more categorical about the determination to resist aggression in any form. Thomas, you want
to? I think before we make these comparisons, especially once we go down to more operational, potentially even tactical questions about an actual military crisis in over Taiwan, is I think what you're pretty clearly hinting at here. It just helps to maybe talk briefly about some of the aspects that don't receive the amount of attention, the aspects in the war in the Russian invasion of Ukraine that don't receive the amount of attention I think that they will receive, if I'm not completely misguided, once historians start writing about this war. So what is the biggest conversation we're not having? I would assume the biggest conversation we're not having, apart from simply the types of war crimes that we simply haven't been able to uncover yet, and I suspect there will be a lot of it, is technology. And the role, I don't mean cyber operations, although that's probably what a lot of people think here. I mean the role of signals intelligence support for the Ukrainian armed forces. That the West, that Five Eyes, especially the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, is likely providing to the Ukrainians, and how that support has evolved from shortly before the war throughout the course of the conflict. To put it bluntly, I would make the assumption that Western countries are not just delivering weapon systems to Ukraine, but in many cases, to be determined in detail, also where to point very specifically and when to point very specifically these specific weapon systems in order to have maximum effect. So that, I think, is a fascinating aspect that I'm sure China, for example, is watching as well, as they are trying to assess the question you're raising. What does that mean for us in Taiwan? And that's going to be a fascinating conversation down the line, one that we are simply not having. The whole cyber operations conversation is very much focused on Russian capabilities, Russian wipers, and specific types of tools and malware that they have deployed in Ukraine. And simply, I mean, I don't think we should go into any detail in this forum, but let me just draw a bottom line and observe, perhaps provocatively, that the Russian performance on the cyber operations front has been a disappointment that arguably reflects the impact that they didn't have on the battlefield.
Let me quickly turn to Michael. I want to at least give you one or two chances for a question here. But so let me slightly rephrase the question, Michael, which is, did deterrence fail here? And are there lessons about deterrence that should be learned either for future European conflicts or others?
Yeah, I think it did. I'm not sure that there's a lot more that could have been done. I think some of the sort of theories on deterrence, like deterrence by detection, didn't do so well, to be perfectly honest,
Right.
that I've heard out here in DC. I think it's a fair test of that proposition. I think that it certainly would have helped if more people believed that the war was coming. I learned a lot professionally that looming major war in Europe with all the political indicators and every single military indicator you could possibly want for as an analyst on the board showing that country X is really planning to invade country Y. Even in the very run up to the invasion, a lot of people won't believe it. They're willing to believe literally anything other than that. They're willing to believe that this is like the Fabergé egg version of coercive diplomacy rather than it is actually exactly what it looks like. Like, this country is going to invade this other country, which they've already invaded before and have a clear track record of invading with maximalist warnings, but you can't convince anybody of it. And so I hope people learn from that if the conversation ever comes to Taiwan and China. And there's similar indicators. I hope, 5, 7, maybe probably won't happen. But even if we have a buildup like that, I hope next time around people won't say, you know what, this is just an incredibly ornate case of coercive diplomacy. They're trying to make it so authentic, but we're pretty sure they're not going to do an operation like this, because that would be incredibly boneheaded. And we know that political leaderships, especially in personalist authoritarian systems, never make colossal blunders or mistakes, right? That's what this war, that's what this war teaches. So if it looks unrealistic and the costs are going to be high, we know they definitely won't do it. That's the clear lesson from this war. But no, I know I'm going to end up having this debate again, so I'm already forecasting the future because it's going to happen again. And by the way, that's part of the reason where we probably didn't talk as much about what the Russian likelihood of success was, because people in my committee were so busy just trying to convince Europeans and others that the war was going to happen. And they didn't want to believe it. They wanted to believe anything other than the fact that the war was going to happen. That we didn't really get into the proposition of, how could this shake out and what's the worst versus better case scenario and what have you. And two brief points. So on European security, the lesson, at least for me from this war, is a great reminder of why European security has to be managed together with Europe and the United States, and why it can't be managed by Europeans alone, okay? Because it's clear for this conflict shows that two things. First, European militaries without the United States in a leading and integrating role cannot scale force employment. They cannot deal with a large-scale military contingency on their continent, right? They do not come together off of paper, no matter how you see them kind of on paper, into the capacity to employ force at scale in Europe and to manage a problem like Russia. The second one is that this war teaches you that these wars very much come down to attrition, and any European military, where most of them would have been off the battlefield in the first couple of weeks of this war. If you look at the losses of manpower, material, and ammunition, we've been gone very early on, would not have been able to sustain it. So the United States retains a very important role in Europe. and folks should not have wishful thinking. There's some people who instrumentally have said, turns out Russians are hobbits with nuclear weapons, so the United States can go and focus entirely on China, and we can leave Germany and France and others to handle Russian European security. I drew the opposite conclusion from how this war has unfolded so far. And looking at European stocks, by the way, this war alone is going to set back NATO many years just to rearm from arming Ukraine, for this war in the first 12 months of this war. I don't know how many years it'll set back NATO if as this war is likely going to continue this for at least the coming year or two. And beyond that, the only other point I make is I think we learned a lot about how we've been talking about the operating environment being, whether great power competition or strategic competition, but really about dealing with adversaries like Russia and China. But a lot of defense planning has been using as bill pairs, maintenance, sustainment, stockpiles, defense industrial production, ammunition. We're very brittle on that front, very brittle. It's sort of really great preparations for a possible, great power conflict, but only if it lasts a couple months. And I think the U.S. has drawn a lot of lessons from this war as to what we need to fix in defense industrial base and stockpiles and other aspects of the defense enterprise.
Great. All right, let's get a couple of quick questions from the audience. Yeah. Okay, quickly, because I do.
Yeah. So on deterrence, I think there was an important missed opportunity in 2014. The Ukrainian, when Ukraine was born nuclear because of how much Soviet arsenal was on its territory, and neither Washington nor Moscow wanted that position to continue. So Ukraine was offered a deal. If you basically dismantle or surrender your nuclear weapons or return them or give them to Russia, you will get territorial integrity assured. And Russia signed on to that not only as a signatory, but as a guarantor. Right. And so in 2014, when Russia, as a guarantor of Ukrainian territorial integrity, violated territorial integrity, we should have done more to enforce the Budapest Memorandum as deterrent. Right. The tragic consequence we have now is that, judging by some of the serial numbers in the wreckage, missiles, non-nuclear weapons returned from Ukraine to Russia are now being used by Russia to kill people in Ukraine.
Okay. Exactly. All right, I want to get to the audience member. Thanks. We'll start right here.
So first, I just wanted to thank you all so much for coming here. This has been a fantastic panel. It's been very informative. Just loved it. In terms of the future and that bright day when this war is behind us, how do you see the European security architecture being established? Particularly, can there be a successful security architecture in Europe without Russia? I was talking with several people at the Munich conference this weekend, and it seemed they weren't sure whether Russia can or should be part of it. It didn't seem like anyone had a really made up mind on this. So I was wondering what you thought.
Let me get one more question, and then we'll try to get the audience to do both. We'll go right here.
Thank you again for being here. This has been very informative. This is a question for Mr. Kofman. You mentioned how the buildup was so obvious and it was just calling for war. Do you think that Russia's rhetoric for use of nuclear weapons, whether that be tactical or not, is a bluff or like a specific or a clear lineup that we'll look at later on? Be like, how did we not take this seriously?
Great. So Michael, why don't you take that? And Barry, if you could talk about sort of you're the dry end of European security architectures. Assuming this war ends in the way that Anne wants it to end, and many of us want it to end, is there a way of bringing Russia back in through an architecture that includes Russia? So let's start with Michael on the nuclear question, and then Mary on the future of European security.
Can I make a brief comment on European security too? Is that allowed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So on the nuclear side, the honest answer is I don't know. I think that this war has clearly shown that Russian leadership is only likely to use nuclear weapons under certain conditions. And despite having lost a huge amount of manpower, material, suffered several operational defeats, they've not done that. I think the conditions that most people are looking at is a potential cascade failure of the Russian military, a real collapse of the Russian military effort, one that's unrecoverable. And then what Russian political leadership choose to do, I don't know. As I said this morning on PR, I'm not a Putinologist. I don't live in his head. And one thing I dislike is the field of Russia studies and the subfield of Russian military studies being trivialized as something like Putinology. That's not what people really do. Okay. There are folks in leadership studies. They do write books about leaders. Yeah, that's fair. But most of us don't do Putinology. That's the field of commentary. That's not the field of research and analysis. So with that in mind, it really at the end of the day will come down to a small group of people and one person particularly among them, right? And your theory on what Putin will choose to do is as good as mine. I do think it's a serious risk that people consider. I think it's a risk that it's worth not overrating and saying there's something deterministic about it, right? But also, not sort of whistling past the graveyard and just having these alibis. Because I'll tell you, there are folks I've listened to who basically say, oh, they just won't do it. And their arguments sound eerily exactly the same as the arguments and reasoning of the people who said Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine. Okay? Actually, a lot of them are the same people, to be perfectly honest. And so I'm a little worried. I'm not saying that this is going to happen because the indicators aren't there, right? The objective indicators that you can assess are not there that Russia's going to use nuclear weapons. You're just not seeing them. I'm saying be cautious of this conversation. And maybe like 10 seconds on European security. So look, Russia's in Europe. It's not in Europe as a political community, but geographically, you're always going to be dealing with it one way or another. Russian military is going to rebuild at some point. It's not an if, but a when. But for me, European security architecture is only one question. Is Russia going to at some point become a stakeholder in European security architecture, or will it be the object of it, where the purpose of European security architecture is to manage the threat from Russia? Or Russia will be a stakeholder in European security architecture one day in an idealized future to help maintain peace in Europe, right? And Anne had, I think, really good comments and answers early on in our conversation about what it would take to help Russia get there, right? And one of the obvious ones is Russian leaders and Russian society would have to admit that this is a mistake, right? And they would have to rethink their role and their identity and the kind of country they want to be.
Yeah, so we're extending this event by about 7 hours, so I can discuss this question. Great. Okay, I'll settle in. No, I mean, obviously, this is a huge question, and we only have a few minutes left. Perhaps I'll just say one broader point. So I had the great privilege to study history at Yale with Paul Kennedy, who, as many of you know, wrote a book about the dangers of imperial overstretch. And my friend Arnie Westad now teaches there as well. And Arnie has been arguing that what we are seeing now is a case of imperial overstretch. Even though Russia has just launched the first land war of the 21st century and was one of only two strategic nuclear powers to emerge, the first land war of the 21st century and one of only two nuclear powers to emerge in the 20th century, Russia has just failed at a 19th century challenge. It has failed to incorporate approximate territory that it wants to incorporate. And we have seen a clear pattern, as Paul Kennedy has shown, of what happens when an empire overextends itself that way. It does not end well for that country in the long run. The problem is that country does a lot of damage on the way down. And so to get to your question about the order of European security, I think it's too soon to talk about that because we're not clear on how much damage it's going to do on the way down. We're not clear when that moment is going to come where there has to be a reckoning with the dangers of empire. It's still not clear when that's going to happen. That, by the way, is a credit to the Ukrainians, right? If you ask the question, what have we learned in the year since the invasion? What we have not learned is how this ends, which is remarkable, right? Because on February 24th, the morning of, right, it looked like there was a massive invasion. It was going to be over soon, right? For those of us who weren't experts. And here we are a year out, and Biden has just gone to Kyiv, and we don't know how the war ends. So I don't think we can yet talk about.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. And, when newer architectures emerge, it's usually because wars end and somebody loses, right? And so I think that is, it's hard to imagine the solution to this that creates a new architecture without a fundamental change in Russia, which I think is the message that many have given here. Look, this has been a great discussion. As you said, Mary, we could go on for 7 hours. I don't want to abuse the time of the good audience that we've had here, but thanks to Anne virtually and to the three of you here and to all of you who participated this morning. More to come. I regret this is going to be with us for a while, I think, and so we will continue to share thoughts and views of the extraordinary talent that we have here at SAIS and Johns Hopkins. So thank you all for coming.